We're going to cover a fairly broad swathe of what we might call diplomatic history today. That is a number of wars. But the thing about all of this is, I don't remember who it was who first said, yeah, I hate history. It's just one damn thing after another, right? It's just a succession of unrelated facts and dates and wars and peace treaties. That's often the way it seems when you're in school, of course, particularly in grade school or high school, when it really is just about memorizing dates. Now, I personally am of two minds about this because, on the one hand, modern historiography and the way history tends to be taught and written in the academy, that is to say, in universities, it's all against this sort of thing. Now it's all about theories and culture and language and linguistics and gender and race and transnational concepts and theories and interdisciplinary, all of this. The fashionable stuff these days is not at all about dates and wars and treaties. But being in an IR department, international relations, I feel like I have the luxury where I can give you some of this, because after all, this is important. You need to know the names of some of the major wars of modern history. You need to know the names of some of the major peace treaties, which are up here, some of which you probably already know. I threw in a couple ones from Ottoman history to situate ourselves, since I assume you know about Karlovitz or Karlovich, I think you usually call it. You call it Karlovich, Pasarovitz, and Küçük those being three of the most significant treaties regarding relations between the Ottoman Empire and Europe. The first, mostly a treaty with Austria, although there was kind of a holy league involved. The second, particularly concerned with Austria, because it basically knocked the Ottoman Empire permanently out of Hungary. And then, of course, Küçük, we'll get to that eventually, being, you might call it, the warning bell about Russian encroachment, and particularly Russian interest in the Straits, Russian interest in the Second Rome, Russian interest in the Orthodox Christians of the Ottoman Empire. Mostly today, though, we're going to talk about European wars. Because, I mean, in some ways, interesting as all of that is, the struggle in Rumeli in the Balkans between Austria and the Ottoman Empire, it continues, sure. I mean, there are periodic wars and so on. But that's not really where the action is anymore. You remember how I talked about how the center of the fulcrum of world power of geopolitics had shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. The real powers, as you will see, I mean, there's an interesting phrase. This is actually in the little packet I just handed you. If you skip down to the third page and you look at the map of European colonial empires, the primary empires being the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, British, and French. Now, if you think about this, Spain, France, Holland, England, the only thing they really have in common is, of course, that they all have water-going egress, that is, to the Atlantic Ocean. In the case of the Dutch, it's via the English Channel. That is where, remember, the real fulcrum of world power is. Yes, there's still a major trade with Asia, but even there, it's the circumnavigation of Africa via the Atlantic, which makes it possible. So if you look at this, you can begin to see that they're playing in a way in a different league. You know how when you have, say, the World Cup or the Euro Championship, right, 2008. Right now we're in the qualifiers, right, the qualies. I don't know what you call them in Turkish. You want to stay in the main league. In tennis, you have the thing called Davis Cup, right? You want to be in the World League. You don't want to fall down into the second rank. You want to be one of the players contending for the title. In a way, that's what's happening here. These are now the players contending for world power. Austria, you hear a lot about Austria and Prussia in the 18th century. You even hear more about Russia, because Russia, its own rise to power, is so dramatic. I could have written other wars up here. Russia's Great Northern War with Sweden, I probably should have mentioned that. Circa about 1700 to 1720. It's a long war. We'll call that the Great Northern War. Yes, Russia becomes significant, and particularly for the Ottoman Empire, Russia becomes very significant in this era. But that said, neither Russia nor Austria nor Prussia nor the Ottoman Empire is really contending for the great stakes anymore. We have this quote here from a French minister, Choiseul. I think this is at the time of the 7 Years' War, so mid-18th century. And he says, in the present state of Europe, this is the bottom of the third page of the handout I gave you, in the present state of Europe, it is colonies, trade, and in consequence sea power, which must determine the balance of power. The House of Austria, Russia, the King of Prussia, and we might add again the Ottoman Empire, are only powers of the second rank, as are all those which cannot go to war unless subsidized by the trading powers. Cannot go to war unless subsidized by the trading powers. We know what subsidized means, right? In other words, someone has to pay. I mean, one of the things you notice here, I mean, you could throw in all of the Austro-Ottoman wars. You've got one from, what, 1683 up to Karlovitz, 1699. The one before Passarowitz, 1716 to 18. There are more conflicts in the 1730s, also, of course, 1780s. There are other conflicts going on. But these are kind of, in some ways, the main ones that are determining the shape of the modern world. If you just look at these, although there are pauses, they seem to be endless. I mean, you have a series of wars between mostly England and Holland, the Dutch, Netherlands. It's a little confusing, the different names. Formally, we now know the country as the Netherlands. In shorthand, it's called Holland, but they're often simply referred to as the Dutch. Anyway, so they're called the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Mostly wars fought at sea, although there were land battles. It's confusing because in the third of them, the French and English were actually on the same side, which is extremely unusual. And yet they didn't even win, which is even stranger. I mean, it was sort of a draw. But the Dutch, the main problem that the Dutch are facing here throughout these wars is that war is expensive for everyone. For the Dutch, it's particularly expensive because they need to field a navy just like the English do. But they also need to defend what is essentially a very low-lying country. We know these countries in shorthand parlance as the Low Countries. If you've ever been there, has anyone ever been to Holland, Belgium? Well, I mean, the main thing that they did even back in the 1950s in Holland, every so often they have problems with the dikes, is they literally have to keep the water out because it lies so low that, you know, the water just inundates the countryside. So low countries, although they do have some advantages regarding rivers and streams, they're not really enormous rivers, so they don't really have adequate defenses in geographic terms. And they certainly don't have mountains to defend them. And so it's a country easily invaded, so they have to field a large army, particularly in relation to the size of the population. So eventually, the Dutch they almost fall by the wayside just because they can't afford it anymore. They can't afford to do both the army and the navy. France has to do the same thing. They have to pay for a large army. I mean, you can look at the size here. You look at the size of the French army. I mean, this figure is astonishing. At the time of these wars, these two wars, in some ways you can say they're really both about, you know, the French effort to dominate Europe, the Sun King, Louis XIV, Louis XIV. Those wars, I mean, there's a lot else going on. But anyway, these wars, France's army reaches, you know, a size not seen in Europe really since the days of the Roman Empire, a standing army of almost 400,000 men. That's on the first page of your table here. And you look at this compared to Britain, which is fighting France, and they're fighting them on land. Britain has an army of only about 70,000. Now, Britain and France are also both paying for large navies, of course, right? So you can see why Britain has a substantial advantage regarding its navy. Its army is about 1/6 the size of the French army. Now that said, even that is misleading because in a lot of these wars, particularly beginning with the wars around 1700 with the Sun King, Britain starts paying for other people's armies too. So they're not only paying for their own army. But the basic fact remains that France, partly because of its ambitions, and partly because of its size, and also partly because of geography, has to field these enormous armies. Well, it doesn't have to. It's, you know, they choose to. Whereas England doesn't. That's a very serious advantage England has. There's a famous French historian, Manuel Leroy-Ladurie, I think, and he used to begin his lectures you know, on modern kind of strategic history. He would say, "Mesdames et messieurs, l'Angleterre est une île." Does anyone know a little bit of French? No? Anyway, so, you know, ladies and gentlemen, right, England is an island. Now, it's not exactly news, but it's significant. And you should never completely forget this, because England, after all, as an island, has the English Channel to guard it against invading armies. Of course, the joke back in the 1990s when they completed the Channel was that the Germans would no longer have to mount a naval armada to invade England. They can just hop on the train. So it's a lot easier than it used to be. But interestingly, it's a little-known fact of these wars that the French actually did. They outfitted an amphibious invasion force of almost 25,000 soldiers ready to invade England. Napoleon is a little bit later in the course, but we'll learn that Napoleon was actually offered the same basic deal by the French government when he was kind of becoming a popular victorious general after he'd won in Italy. They wanted to get rid of him, and so they said, "Why don't you go invade England?" And he said, "No thanks, I'm going to invade Egypt instead." Because he didn't want to lose, basically. It didn't go well, basically. They barely made it out into the Channel before the Dutch and the English Navy kind of surrounded them. So, the French, they're much richer than the English. We'll talk more about finance in the second half of today's lecture. They have a much larger population base. I think you have population here, too. Yeah, this is also on the first page. The French population at the time of these wars, about 1700, is more than twice that of the British Isles. By the time of the Revolution, France's population is 25 to 27 million. It's still about 20 million. So they have a much larger population base. Overall, the country is richer. It is richer in foodstuffs. They have better wine. All of that's true, too. But the main thing is, then, France, although it's richer, France has to pay for a much larger army. And so this is a serious disadvantage. The English are also figuring out that they have a real advantage against France in that they can very easily find anyone on the continent who doesn't want to be dominated by France will team up with them. And that's why it was a little bit unusual, I said, this third Anglo-Dutch war. I mean, it's a real anomaly in some ways in modern history, and that England and France temporarily were on the same side. The reason England wanted to support France was because, we forget this today, but the Dutch actually, in some ways, were a more sophisticated and, in fact, essentially the great world power even before the English were. We've completely forgotten this. If you've ever been to New York, has anyone been to New York? You know that it was originally New Amsterdam, right? I mean, it was originally founded by the Dutch. The Dutch Empire predated the English Empire, when it came to most of their significant trading concessions in Asia. The Dutch were pioneers when it came to things like shipbuilding, navigation. The Dutch, again, learning from powers like the Portuguese and Spanish who preceded the Dutch. Remember that their heyday was kind of the 1500s. The Dutch, you might call it their heyday. It didn't last as long because they had been oppressed by Spain, remember, in the 80 Years' War. Roughly from kind of the early 1600s until about, say, 1670, 1675, the Dutch were arguably the greatest power in the world. Strange as that sounds, because their population, if you look here, they're known as the United Provinces, if you're looking at the graph. It's pretty amazing. They've got less than 2 million people. Now, it's not to say they had the largest army in the world, but they had the most sophisticated navy, and they also had by far the most sophisticated financial and tax system in the world, which allowed them to finance this navy. And they had major trading concessions in Asia. Mostly, we know the Dutch Empire today by way of, I guess, Indonesia being the greatest long-serving example of a Dutch colony. Indonesia, which has, I think, actually fantastic food. But Indonesia, which the reason the food is good is because of the spices, so that they had a great kind of almost a spice monopoly. The Portuguese were still also heavily involved in the spice business, but the Dutch have begun to surpass them, as a much greater power. So it doesn't last very long, but for a little while the Dutch, believe it or not, are really kind of like they're the coming thing. Everyone wants to copy and imitate the Dutch. And so the English, they're sort of jealous of them. I mean, in some ways, there's a funny line about how the British Empire came to be. We think of the British Empire, again, as like the establishment. I mean, after all, the modern world speaks English. It doesn't speak Dutch. If you go to Amsterdam today, everyone speaks English. If you go to London, no one speaks Dutch. So you can see that England really won in the long run. Some of it, though, was luck. Because, after all, they're not really even winning their own wars against the Dutch. They have to team up with France just to stop the Dutch. It's not until about 15 or 20 years after this that things start to turn the other way when the Dutch realize they need the English more than the English need them. Now, for the reasons why, geography is obviously the most, I suppose, the simplest answer, that the Dutch had to defend their territory, whereas England, being an island, did not. There were other factors, though. I mean, the English, they were good at certain things. Oddly enough, one of the best talents they had was for piracy. In fact, this is really how the English got started. In fact, in some ways, it's kind of almost like the reverse of what happened with the Industrial Revolution. With the Industrial Revolution, the English were first, which was great for a while, but eventually it meant that other powers could kind of copy and imitate them and improve upon certain things. When it came to empire, it was completely the opposite. The English were sort of the last of the Atlantic powers to emerge as an imperial center. They were after the Spanish, after the Portuguese, after the Dutch, and even to a certain extent after the French. This is partly because England was really wrapped up in its own civil war for most of the first half of the 1600s. England, remember, didn't even fight in the 30 Years' War. England was really just pretty wrapped up in its own problems. To the extent England had any foreign policy regarding empire and colonies at all, it was pretty simple. It's basically, they had heard that the Spanish had gotten really rich because of all the silver and gold, and so they wanted some too. So they went out looking for silver and gold. Like, if you've ever heard of this phrase, El Dorado, there are various versions of the myth. Usually it's somewhere in South America, some mythical, like the really bad Indiana Jones movie they made. It was El Dorado, I think, right? The one they just made a year or two ago. And, they said, oh, it wasn't gold and silver. It's weird modern political correctness. No, it's some multicultural message or something. Of course El Dorado was about gold. I mean, that's what they wanted to find. They wanted to find gold. The Spanish, they thought, had gotten rich. They didn't realize that it was sort of a curse, to have gotten all the gold and silver. So they wanted to go find gold and silver, too. And so they looked. They looked in places like Canada. Some of the early English kind of explorers, a lot of them were actually fishermen. In fact, the very first thing that they found was that Newfoundland, which is up, the coast of, I guess you probably have a map here, off the coast of Canada, sort of facing, you can see it here on the map, Newfoundland, facing the British. This is one of the very first places the British started settling on like a small scale. Basically, that was all about fish. There was a lot of cheap fish there. There was a lot of cheap fish in the Baltic Sea too, but that was dominated by other powers. So, some of them were going looking for fish. But really, what most of the ambitious ones wanted to find was gold. So they looked in places like this. They looked in Canada. They looked in various of their own islands. Other islands had already been settled, by the other powers like the Spanish or the Dutch or the French. And they couldn't find any gold. And so what they decided to do instead was to steal it. So they would send out ships and, just basically try to steal the gold from the Spanish. In fact, like during the wars that we were looking at last week, the time of the Armada, remember they defeat the Spanish Armada famously in 1588, although they really got kind of lucky because of the weather. This whole period, this is in the kind of high Elizabethan age, think Shakespeare basically. The English, they were kind of a raw, rough and ready upstart country. We think of Shakespeare today, even like his plays and so on, as being, the language is very elevated and refined. But that's not at all what the plays were like at the time. His plays were seen as, like if you watch that movie, Shakespeare in Love, you get the idea. His plays are seen as kind of like lowbrow entertainment. It's all about like blood and guts and love and passion and murder and stuff like that. That's kind of what England was like at the time. It was a rough and ready place. It was not as refined or sophisticated or wealthy as any of the old Mediterranean countries, certainly not like the Spanish or the Portuguese. And so anyway, so what they would do is they would just kind of quietly encourage, there was a phrase for it, they called them privateers. What a privateer was basically, could have been a pirate, it could have also been someone who was a little more respectable than that. The crown would just basically say, hey, look, we'll kind of sort of support you. We're not going to pay you a lot of money, but why don't you go, rob some gold from one of those Spanish ships and just give us a cut. It's a much cheaper way of basically kind of carrying out a strategic policy than actually outfitting a navy. So in the early days, that's what the British did. They copied the Dutch, they robbed the Spanish, and then eventually they beat the French. That's the line, right? So they copy the Dutch, they beat the Spanish. They robbed the Spanish, and then eventually they, beat the French. France and Britain are sort of like the only survivors from this whole era, by the end of it. So Britain, they start out small. They start spending more seriously on their navy after the Civil War is over. In fact, in this period, the 1650s, this is the period of Cromwell. It's very confusing. Cromwell was part of this movement, usually called the Puritans. They were the ones, who didn't like the fact that the king was spending money without consulting Parliament, and so there was a whole rebellion, and then they cut off the king's head. And then for a while, they didn't have a king. In 1660, they brought back the king. So England has a revolution, kind of a civil war. And after they emerge from this, the Restoration era, they become a little bit more respectable in a way. They kind of leave the whole piracy and privateering thing behind. Not entirely. There's still a little bit of the Johnny Depp territory going on, with the pirates, right? But still, they're becoming a little more respectable. They start building a proper navy. They start spending... Some of that went back to Elizabeth, too. Some of it went back to Henry VIII. But really, this is the first time they're kind of becoming a proper rival to the Dutch and to the French. They've emerged from their time of troubles, slightly more unified than before. Still, they don't really win. I mean, it's very confusing. They don't really beat the Dutch. They just kind of outlast the Dutch. Because the Dutch eventually, as I said, they kind of get bankrupted by the fact that they have to keep fielding larger and larger armies. I mean, if you just look at the size of these armies that they're fielding, you look at this by the time of these wars, again, the wars of kind of the Sun King, right around 1700, the Dutch are yielding an army of 130,000 men, which doesn't maybe sound that enormous. But then you look at their population, they have only 2 million people. So that means like 1 out of 6 or 7 people is either a soldier. Some of them are mercenaries, of course, who were brought in from outside the country. But it's a very small population base supporting a fairly large army. As opposed to Britain, which has 4 or 5 times as many people and is fielding an army half the size. That's the real advantage the British had. But the Dutch, the interesting thing is they don't really behave in the way you might expect. They're not that bitter. They realize eventually that they're going to need English support, or else they're just going to be swamped up by the French. The real kind of driving force behind most of these wars is the Sun King, Louis XIV, the one who says, as you remember, "L'État, c'est moi." The state, it is me. So to a certain extent, you have a political factor here. It's not like the religious wars, remember, where people are really fighting over their beliefs. But there's a bit of that still. France has gone back to being Catholic. In 1685, I think I mentioned this already, France had an edict of religious toleration. In the previous century, it is revoked by the Sun King. That is, he revokes, it's actually called, I think, the Restitution Act. He revokes the principle of religious toleration. So he literally says we will no longer allow Protestants in France. It's not that they're going to physically exterminate them all, but they are going to be considered heretics. And so what do you think a lot of them do? Are they going to stick around? Remember, they're called Huguenots. French Protestants. Where do you think they might go? If you were a French Protestant, your king says, I don't want you anymore. I won't tolerate you anymore. Where are you going to go? I mean, somewhere else, probably. But what kind of a country might you go to? You want to go to a Protestant country, right? So a lot of them go to Holland. A lot of them actually end up in America. In fact, there are all these Huguenot settlements, like in the Hudson Valley north of New York City. Many of them by way of Holland. Many of them Dutch-speaking, because the whole Hudson Valley in New York, remember, originally New Amsterdam. A lot of Dutch settlements there. So a lot of them end up in America. A lot of them end up in England. And England, it's a little bit confusing, because England, remember, even today it has a substantial Catholic population. But it is a predominantly Protestant country. That goes back to particularly Henry VIII. And his idea was kind of opportunistic. It was, we'll no longer be Catholics, and that way I get to rob all of the church property. Which is an idea that occurs to a lot of leaders in the modern era. But eventually, the country is mostly Protestant. The Puritans, Cromwell, they're sort of like extreme Protestants. You have all of these dissenting sects. The Puritans being the most famous example, the Quakers being another. A lot of them ended up settling in America. I think I mentioned this probably in the very first week, that to understand America's political culture, the peculiarities and the unique qualities of it, you have to understand that it's not just Protestants that settled the country. It was dissenting Protestants. In other words, those who had a very pure strain of religion in mind. Not to say they were zealots necessarily, although some of them were a little extreme. The idea is they did not want to submit to any authority. So that even in England, where eventually you had the Church of England, the Anglican Church as it's usually called today, it's a little confusing because although it's Protestant, it has certain elements which remind other Protestants of Catholicism. You know, it's a state establishment. It's kind of run by the state. They have things like communion, communion with the body and blood of Christ, with Catholics, which Catholics also do. They have different sermons, different prayers. They're still not Catholics. They still do not, recognize the authority of the Pope. But so in England, you have a kind of established Protestant church. And other Protestants didn't like that. They thought even that was too much. And so most of them, either they were persecuted or they fled to America. And then England, again, it's very confusing, but in the time of the Restoration after Cromwell, the Stuart kings, not all of them, but most of the Stuart kings were actually Catholic. And that's one of the reasons why, again, temporarily, it's very confusing. But in the Third Anglo-Dutch War, the English king was a Catholic, and that's part of the reason he supported France against Holland. So there are exceptions to every rule, and that, in a way, is the exception to the basic rule of that kind of area and most of modern geopolitical history. The pattern reverts, you might say, more to the norm in 1688 to 89. We could just call it 1689 to be simple. It's called the Glorious Revolution. Do you remember this at all from school textbooks in England? The Glorious Revolution. It's a little bit confusing, but part of it has to do with, remember, the French threat, a war which has already begun in the year before with France making a push again to dominate Holland and expand its power. The Dutch finally decide that they cannot handle the French threat alone. And so in a way they kind of negotiate almost a deal with the English. Remember I said they weren't really bitter. They could have just been bitter, but they decide, well, okay, look, we're going to have to team up. Because otherwise this French bully, the Sun King, the kind of galloping Catholic, who's no longer tolerating Protestants, who wants to dominate Europe, almost like, remember, the Habsburgs before in Charles V. It's not quite that extreme. I mean, he doesn't really want to be Holy Roman Emperor. He just wants to be the great kind of French king. But so the Dutch and the English, they sort of team up. William of Orange, who has this title in Holland, he's called the Stadtholder. He has certain ties also to the continental aristocracy, but he also has ties to the English aristocracy, and they accept him as their new king. Which doesn't sound, again, all that exciting, except remember that a lot of these wars theoretically are fought over this notion of succession, that is, who succeeds. That's why this war is sometimes called King William's War, or the War of the English Succession. It's also sometimes called the 9 Years' War, because it lasted 9 years. But to sum it up, King William, in a way, is what it was really about. Maybe not at the beginning, but that became what it was about. He was the new English king. He was Protestant. He was of Dutch origin. Okay, so they were Protestants. They're opposing the Sun King, who is the great, remember, crusading Catholic who no longer tolerates Protestants. There's a little bit more to it than that, though. Modern financial historian Neil Ferguson, who is often on CNN, if you ever happen to watch CNN, he has a funny phrase about this. He calls the Glorious Revolution, he always likes to tweak people, he calls it a Dutch-English business merger. Now, what he meant by that, well, there were a couple of things. One of which is that a lot of Dutch merchants, bankers, and even certain high-born Dutch aristocrats were actually given shares in the Dutch, the English version of the East India Company. One of these kind of trading monopolies, a joint stock company, which handled a lot of the Indian trade. Now, there seems to have also been a joint stock company that is, I mean, the modern corporation, we take it for granted, but it was kind of in some ways a great innovation. That is a company which has a legal existence. It's almost like an individual, except that it lasts longer because You know, people come and go and people die and the company endures. It issues stock, that is, you can buy stock in the company, you can sell shares to the public. They were more than that. Some of these companies, because the ones that traded in a place like India, they actually had their own private armies. It's a little bit, again, like the privateering thing that you had with, you know, English pirates. A lot of India was actually kind of conquered and settled by, you might almost call them kind of like buccaneers. Not pirates exactly, but they were not, that is, officers of the crown. They were usually officers of a private company. Well, anyway, the Dutch get shares in this company. There's also a kind of gentleman's agreement about the Asian trade. And this is interesting because the way Ferguson tells the story, the Dutch, because of their base in Indonesia and because of the basic kind of patterns of trade which had already emerged, they wanted to make sure they controlled the spice trade. Spices. Remember how important spices were? That, in a way, is what Columbus was looking for, even though instead, you know, he found the Americas and he found native population and gold and all that. He was originally looking for spices. Because the Dutch thought, well, you can't go wrong with spices. The English, for whatever reason, whether they knew it or not, negotiated a better deal. And it was more or less that they were going to control textiles. Textiles, that is, clothing. One of the dominant industries in early modern India. Although, ironically, eventually the British take over, you know, in the Industrial Revolution, once they figure out with things like, you know, the cotton gin and so on, how to mass produce clothing, they end up destroying the Indian market. Although in the early days, India actually was kind of the great textile production center. So the English say, okay, you can have the spices, we can have textiles. Well, there's a very interesting thing about this, if you think about it. Like, how often do you buy spices? If any of you do, I guess you don't have your own kitchens, right? I mean, you're all in dorms mostly. Do any of you live in apartments? Yeah, so you buy spices sometimes, right? But not that often, right? Like, what do you buy more often? Clothing or spices? Clothing, right? Why? Well, because clothes, I mean, look, in some ways, you can never have enough, right? I mean, you could stop if you're broke, but on the other hand, if you have money, it's always nice to have new clothes, because, you know, clothes wear out. Maybe they go out of fashion. Maybe you want to replace them. Whereas spices, well, I don't know. There's only so much nutmeg you can have use for. Yeah, eventually maybe some spices go bad, but basically they can sit on your shelf for months and months, you know, if not years, right? But that's the whole point of them. It's like you preserve food. So whether it was that the English were more clever or whether no one had figured this out yet, the English got a much better deal. So for the most part, again, this is kind of a gentleman's agreement, although some of it is actually written down. You know, the Dutch are still going to control Indonesia and a lot of the Spice Islands. England, more or less, is given sway in India. Now, again, even that is a simplification because, you know, the Portuguese still have colonies in India, the French have colonies there. But for the most part, the Dutch and English are now, they're sort of like allies. They're almost like a team. Not entirely, but they're sort of like a team. And so the Dutch have agreed to let the English have the textile trade and the Dutch get the spice trade. Textile trade is much more profitable. So that helps England. The fact that England, again, is an island which does not have to field a large army, that also helps England. Gradually, it doesn't happen all right away, but by the 18th century, by, say, like the mid-18th century, England is far and away now the most influential trading power in the world, and the Dutch are kind of sinking into second rank. They're almost like an appendage, a little bit like today how I said everyone in Amsterdam speaks English. You know, it's just, the languages are similar, yes, but it's also that the Dutch became almost like a kind of ally/appendage of the British Empire. Some of it may be because of bad negotiating, some of it just bad geographical luck. You know, they had to keep fighting off the French army, whereas England, whenever France would assemble an army like in 1692, they have to cross the channel. It's almost impossible. It doesn't work. I mean, remember even Hitler tried it. He had Operation Sea Lion. But before he did that, he tried with the Battle of Britain to send over the bombers. That didn't work. England is very difficult to invade, obviously. And so that's a big advantage the English have. But there are a couple of other things that the English, the thing that's so great about it is that they've kind of surpassed the Dutch. But on the other hand, because the Dutch now have investments in London, they also have a lot of people who keep traveling to London. The English are learning from the Dutch. Now, the Dutch themselves, like where they learned it from, you know, is another question. They mostly learned some of these techniques from Italy, but they were improved. What am I talking about? I'm talking about banking largely. I mean, banking is something, we really do kind of take for granted. Although, I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago this notion of Islamic banking and usury. You remember I asked you and we weren't sure what the term was? I'll just write it up here, because this is, again, another one of these very key things in kind of modern world history, which is sometimes taken for granted. Usury, this is the English term. I wrote down the Arabic term. I think I have it here. The Arabic term is riba. Do you have that in Turkish? I think it's just an Arabic word. Well, do we know what usury is? From the Bible. Loaning money at interest. Faiz. Faiz, I think? Yeah, faiz, right. So you loan money at interest. Money lending. Now, famously, this is prohibited by the Quran. It's also prohibited in the Bible. And so in medieval Europe, you had the same prohibition, which is why a lot of the early banking dynasties, although not all of them, were Jewish. Well, anyway, so I did a little bit of just kind of checking up on this. It turns out there's no one single term. The basic idea is that certain banks are either Sharia compliant or not. And most of the ones that claim to be Sharia compliant banks, that is Islamic banks, most of them are based in either Iran or Saudi Arabia, as you might expect. Kind of you have the strictest of the Sunni states and the strictest of the Shia states. Now, how do they get around it? It's actually very interesting. I couldn't understand all of it, frankly. It's so complicated. But the concept of mortgage lending, I think I got that figured out. Because after all, if you buy a house, you borrow money, right? I mean, very few people have enough money to buy a house. I mean, in Turkey, actually, mortgage lending didn't really get off the ground, I think, until the last 5 or 10 years. Like in a big way, right? It's still pretty new. Borrowing money from banks at interest. That's not necessarily because the banks had to be Sharia compliant here, but that's because it's something where the banks have to have a lot of trust. You have to have a lot of trust in the system. Well, apparently the way it works with the Sharia compliant banks, it's something like this. You're not allowed to loan money at interest. And so what happens instead, I think, is the bank buys the property that you want to buy. And then they sell it to you at a higher price, and then they say that you're paying in installments, kind of like taksit, but that it's not interest. Now, I mean, what's interesting about this is it's basically the same thing, right? Except it's structured differently. It's defined differently. Because of this, you might call it a kind of a taboo or a piety, that you are trying to get around. Now, you can see in this example that even in the modern world, the concept is still not everywhere the same. That in fact, it's not as easy as you think to devise a way of doing this while still being compliant with, let's say, cultural or religious values. Now, the great secret of modern Europe and its emergence as a power, again, there's the military argument, I talked about the cultural one, the religious one. But I mean, if you really get down to it, the thing that does seem to distinguish these new emerging world powers like Britain, France, and the Dutch before they get eclipsed is this notion that they are able to finance wars. I mean, you look at all these wars, I mean, look how long they last, right? You've got basically kind of on and off for 25 years, England is fighting Holland, and they're fighting at sea. In other words, every time one of these ships gets sunk, it has to be replaced. You're talking about like ships of the line. Here we have size of the navies, ships of the line. I mean, these are immensely expensive, like the early modern equivalent of a modern aircraft carrier, you might call them. This is, a battleship which mounts cannon, which is able to, it's basically a sailing vessel, but it's able to travel for long distances, lay in stores, supplies, provisions. Now, England, as you can see, England starts out in about the beginning of this war, 1689. England has about the same number as France, 100 to 120. You can see that by the end of this period, England has 2 to 3 times as many as anyone else. I wish this went back a little earlier, because then you could compare the size of the Dutch in the English Navy. But the basic point is these things are expensive. It's basically the largest, almost like half of England's public expenditure, or at least its military expenditure, goes towards building these ships. And yet they only have about 100 of them. So you imagine like one of these wars, if you sink just 5 or 10 of these ships, you're talking about a humongous portion of the budget. They're very expensive. Then you look at these wars. You know, there are naval battles along with land battles. Remember, the French army is up to like 400,000 men who all demand permanent salaries. You know, they need to be supplied and fed and so on and so forth. England, by this time, is actually paying not only for its navy and its army, it's paying for like other people's armies too. It's immensely expensive. So how can they pay for it? You remember this quote about how only the trading powers were able to pay for it? Well, that was a Frenchman who was saying that. And I think he himself, Choiseul, might not have entirely understood the real secret of public finance. He thought it was wealth, trading wealth. You know, you had to have access to the Atlantic Ocean, the slave trade, the sugar trade, the coffee trade, maybe the spice trade, textiles. Yeah, that was true up to a point. I mean, you had to have a large base of wealth. But even that wasn't really enough, because if you look at the expenditures during these wars, they go way beyond what the countries themselves are actually able to raise. If you look here at just British expenditures, this is in the middle page of your packet. Again, I wish it went back earlier, but you know, we're starting about this time. We're starting with King William's War here, 1688. Total expenditure, and this is in million pounds. You know, back in these earlier wars, we're talking about maybe a few tens of millions of pounds. 50 million pounds per year. Total income about 32, 33 million. Oh, that's interesting. So, oh, that's not annual. I think that's total. But anyway, so the amount raised by loans is about 33%. That is 1 out of every 3 pounds sterling that Britain is spending is borrowed. Now, France, if you actually look at this period, France borrows, it's kind of like roughly similar. France spends about the same. They borrow roughly the same. But by the late 18th century, as we all know, France is the country that has a revolutionary meltdown, and England does not. We'll look a little more closely at some of the reasons involving taxation and politics in the second half of the lecture, but for now, I'll tell you the single key fact that you have to know, which is that by the 1780s, England and France had virtually equal public debts. That is the total amount of money that they owed to their creditors. France's population was 2 to 3 times as large. But France had the revolution and England didn't. Why? Well, the single largest proximate cause was interest, faiz. France was paying 6 to 7% on its loans, and England was paying 3%. Now, as to why, that in itself is a very interesting question. How are we doing on time, by the way? I don't have my watch handy. Is it 30? Okay, so we'll stop the first hour, and when we come back, we're going to look at some of these differences. Why? Basically the question, why was France paying twice as much interest on its loans, on its debt, as England?